Hello and welcome. In one of the last programs, which was devoted to the life cycle of empires, there was a very interesting entry in the comments. Well, one of the viewers suggested that in the aspect of the collapse of civilization, we should also refer and discuss Joseph Unwin's book, Sex and Culture. I did a short research on the internet and it turned out that this book is also translated into Polish. Here is a Polish copy of this book. Let me read a fragment of the description, which will introduce us very quickly to the topic. And then we will move on to the main point of the program. But for now, I ask for a moment of patience, and I promise you will not be disappointed. Here is the fragment. The starting point of the extensive research of Joseph Unwin, who, in an attempt to verify the Freudian claim that civilization is a byproduct of repressed sexuality, and this I would emphasize, civilization is a byproduct of repressed sexuality. Well, Unwin studied 80 different societies. His findings surprised many scholars, most notably himself, because all 80 showed a direct link between monogamy and the expansion energy of civilizations. In other words, the greater the sexual abstinence of a society, the more it developed and the standard of living improved. However, when sexual deviance and attacks on the single-partner lifestyle begin to occur, societies collapsed. In the 80 cases studied, this pattern was confirmed. And now we come to the main point of the program. While doing the research about Joseph Unwin and his book, it turned out that it is available in a paper copy, in PDF, in English and in Polish. And also I came across an outstanding specialist in this book. So we decided to invite him to our talks, and he agreed.
Także teraz przełączamy się na język angielski. Jest ze mną Kirk Durston. Hello, Kirk.
Hello, I'm pleased to be part of this interview.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank you that you have found the time to join us, because it's we consider this subject we will talk about as very, very important. So, for the beginning, could you introduce yourself? I mean, what I will emphasize, I would like that you emphasize that you are precise, that you came from the sciences as mathematics or physics. So, precise brain.
Well, I try to live that way. My first degree was in physics, and then I did a degree in mechanical engineering and worked for Pratt & Whitney, developing experimental aircraft engines at that point. And later on, I got interested in philosophy, so I did a master's in philosophy. And then finally, went back and did a PhD in biophysics and published papers both in philosophy and in biophysics. So it's been part of the way I think for, well, most of my life, I suppose.
Okay, and how it happened that you became the specialist, I think that even the best one in the world, on Joseph Unwin's Sex and Culture?
I had heard him referenced in some talks about his research and how he had studied 86 cultures and the relationship between their sexual constraints and how well that culture flourished in terms of architecture and music and literature and agriculture. So I became very curious, and I'm the type of person who likes to go to the original sources just to make sure that what I'm hearing is actually what the person said. So I got a copy of his book online, and it's available in digital form online, and I went and worked through that the first time, and it's very slow going. Dr. Unwin was a extremely rigorous, pedantic, meticulous scholar in his data collection. So one time was not enough. So I went through it again, highlighting, taking notes, compiling things down to where I could actually transfer that information onto other people. And eventually I published a short article online to do with his research, along with links to what I call a 26-page quote summary. And what that is, it's a selection of quotes. As I worked through his book, I highlighted key statements he made that actually encapsulate or summarize what his research was showing. And I included links to that as well, so people didn't have to just take my word for it or just believe what I said, but they could actually go to this quote summary. And it's 26 pages because I felt it needs, that's an extremely concise summary of what he did, and it gives a person an idea of what he wrote. And then, to my amazement, there was a professor at Princeton University, Robert P. George, who's internationally well known, who happened to read that article within a day of me putting it online, and he actually endorsed that. And once he endorsed that, then I think it got about 500,000 views within a period of a week or so. People actually reading this article. And since then, I've had many interviews, many discussions on Unwin's research.
Okay, so it seems I have this feeling that our discussion will be also very interesting for the Polish audience. Could you introduce Joseph Unwin? Who was he?
Yes, he was a soldier in World War I, and after that war was over, he pursued his education and eventually became a professor at both Oxford University and Cambridge University. And unfortunately, he died very young at the age of 41 in 1936. But his area of expertise was social anthropology. And he's probably best known for a book that he published called Sex and Culture. And that book came out in 1934, 1935. And that is the book that people refer to today. Yes, there it is.
And you said that his way of making scientific research was very precise, was very detailed. Can you tell a little bit of this?
Yes, I have been extremely impressed with his rigor and his precision on his research. So he starts by defining his terms, and he defines each one of the terms he uses in his research precisely, rigorously, and then he looks at his data, the data that he gathered, and it's so detailed and comprehensive. It's almost like a general anesthetic for those people who are not that interested in large quantities of data, but I appreciated the rigor that he went about it. He refused to let his own interpretations, biases enter in. He really focused on what is the data and what do we observe in this data. Here's another interesting thing about his book. He realized that there's a lot of data in the center section of his book, and so in these opening chapters, he actually gives the reader a suggestion that they can read the first couple of chapters where he defines his terms and so forth. And then if they're not that interested in slugging through all the details of the data, they can then move to the final chapters and his conclusions. And his conclusions are not so much interpretations, but as just observations that he draws from the data. And again, I emphasize that because once a person begins to interpret the data, we are now leaving the realm of objectivity and entering the realm of subjectivity, and he very much tried not to do that. He did have one possible hypothesis that he advanced, but he was very clear this is only a hypothesis, and that is he wondered why it is that the tighter the constraints, and maybe I'll expand on that in a bit, but the tighter the constraints a culture had on their sexual practices, the more they flourished. And that was the great mystery. Why is this correlation there? Correlation does not necessarily mean causation, and Eve was very clear on that. So he only suggested a possible hypothesis at the end of all his research, and that was that if a culture restrains their sexual energy to focus more on productive things, they are more likely to flourish as a culture. Now, that was clearly just his hypothesis at the end of it all, and I read that, and I wasn't 100% convinced of his hypothesis. Could be, maybe not. However, his observations were impeccable, and what he observed was, I think, indisputable. And what he also did is there were some predictions that can be obtained from his research. And these predictions are testable. And this is what I love about the fact that his book was published in the mid-1930s. And here's why. It allowed us this was long before our own sexual revolution in today's civilization. So it allows us to take his research and those 3 predictions and then see if those things are coming true today in our culture. And they are. And I think that's one thing that really verifies the objectivity and the validity of his observations.
Richard Feynman, the famous physician, said that social sciences are not real sciences, as he understood physics, mathematics, and technical sciences. He said that social sciences are pseudo sciences, and I completely agree with him. But regarding Joseph Unwin, could we say that he was really exact scientific guy who make a real research, as we do in technical sciences?
Okay, it's a very good question, and I think one that is relevant as to whether we should take Unwin's findings seriously or not.
But as a matter of fact, you are taking it seriously or not?
Oh, yes. I am taking it seriously.
Okay.
I am, personally. Very much so. And it's because of a couple of different reasons. First of all, in science, observation is extremely important. Observation. Then we form a hypothesis. Then we test that hypothesis. And then to see if that... and these predictions should be falsifiable. In other words, we should be able to make predictions as a result of the observations, and then test those predictions to see if our hypothesis stands or falls. And in the sense, I think Unwin, what he did was provide the observations and the predictions. But he was not able to necessarily draw a hypothesis that he could test from that, because what we needed was another culture that would come along so that we could take his 3 predictions, test it on the next culture that comes along to see if his observations and his hypothesis actually comes true. So the hypothesis that we can draw, and it's more us who draw the hypothesis, and it's hardly even an hypothesis because it was more of an observation Unwin made, and that was this: that as a culture exercise restraint on how they practice their sexuality, as they implement those constraints, they actually flourish more and more in terms of technology, agriculture, music, literature, and so forth. But when they loosen those sexual constraints, then that culture collapses within 3 generations. Those were his observations. It collapses within 3 generations, but there were 3 things that happened first. In fact, you could say maybe 4 things. First of all, as far as the rigor of his observations, that would be as good as anything we do in science. He's taking the data and compiling it, so that's good. The 3 predictions that arise were based on 3 observations that he made, and here they are. First of all, when a culture begins to, first of all, in the first generation after the tipping point is reached, and the tipping point, to my amazement, was when a culture affirmed prenuptial sexual relations as normative. That is, they were just accepted. Now, prenuptial sex has always gone on since the dawn of time, but it's not necessarily accepted. It's not necessarily the norm within a culture. So what he found is that when a culture accepts premarital or prenuptial sexual relations, when it becomes normalized and accepted, that's the tipping point. I was surprised at that.
The first one tipping point.
Well, that is the tipping point. It's not there's three things that happen very quickly after that.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's the tipping point. So what he found is that a culture exercised increased restraint. And what I mean by that, and he clearly defines that very precisely, he measures sexual constraint in terms of what happens before marriage, what happens after marriage. The ultimate that he found was prenuptial chastity, that's his term, coupled with lifelong monogamous marriages. That was the ideal. And when a culture achieved that, they flourished to the highest extent. They could reach some level below that and they would flourish, but not like when they obtained those two ways of living. Prenuptial chastity, postnuptial, lifelong monogamous marriages. So when that flipped, when the prenuptial chastity was no longer required, it was accepted that there would be relations prior to marriage, every culture, without exception, collapsed within 3 generations. There were no exceptions. The first generation after that tipping point remained relatively stable because it's running on the momentum of the previous generation and the achievements of that culture. So the first generation, he did not notice a huge change in these 86 cultures. The second generation, it dramatically accelerated the collapse or the downturn in that culture. And by the time it hit the third generation, it totally collapsed. So here were 3 things that happened in the first generation. Number 1, that culture abandoned its belief in God, or in some cases they had more than one God, but he defined the higher gods as those gods that had control over the universe, over nature, that sort of thing, like Zeus and the Greek gods, for example, because the ancient Hellenists did achieve that high standard as well. But when they reached that tipping point, they abandoned belief in their own gods, the higher gods. In our culture today, we have done that, and what we're observing here, and I certainly observe it here in Canada, is a dramatic abandonment of belief in God. That was the first observation that he made. The culture abandons their belief in God and tends more towards superstition or agnosticism. Second thing he observed is that when that tipping point is crossed, within the next generation, lifelong monogamous marriages begin to be replaced with serial relationships. And again, in our culture today, we have observed the verification of that prediction. For him, it wasn't a prediction. For him, it was simply an observation from the data, but we take those observations, we apply it to our civilization today because it becomes a prediction. If what he observed is correct, we should observe these things happening here. So first of all, abandonment and belief in God. Secondly, lifelong monogamous marriages are abandoned in favor of serial relationships. And the third thing that he observed for these 86 cultures is they abandon rational thinking. They abandoned making decisions via logic and instead began to just make decisions according to what they wanted to believe. Rational thinking was abandoned. That's the third thing. And again, it's just amazing to me on at least our North American culture, this is where I live, on how rational thinking is abandoned to the point of me just being amazed at how our culture makes decisions today, which are not rational, but just based more on what we want to believe. So those are the 3 predictions, or the 3 observations he made. We can take those in the scientific method and say, well, let's get another culture to cross that tipping point and see if these 3 things come true. So those become predictions then in the scientific method. We have our own culture probably crossed that tipping point somewhere in the 1980s. So the first generation has been completed. And in the space of that first generation, we're now in the second, we see those 3 things taking place in a dramatic fashion.
So my question is, because when in the technical sciences, the people discovered some principles, as for example, the three Newtonian principles of dynamics, the law of universal gravity or the law of Ohm. After that, the humanity was able to build, to construct better and better and more sophisticated tools, planes, ships, cars, etc., etc., computers. And these principles, these laws discovered in the technical sciences laid the foundation of the development of technology, of development of things. And my question is, can we consider the discovery of Unwin as some kind of universal social laws on which we can try to build better societies? How do you think about this?
I think we can, but there is a problem. So first of all, I think there are definitely, it seems that we have been designed to function in a certain way. For example, when I purchase something, it almost always comes with a set of instructions of how to maximize my enjoyment or my utilization of that item that I've purchased. It also comes often with a list of things not to do with that item. For example, I purchased a saxophone, an alto saxophone, and to my amazement, one of the things it said not to do was to throw or toss it. Now, I would think anybody who pays that kind of money for a saxophone would naturally understand that's a bad thing to do with your saxophone. But if you throw or toss it, you run the risk of damaging it, and then it won't function as well. In the same way, it seems that we have been designed to function and to flourish and to maximize our potential by observing what we might call a certain level of sexual morality, sexual ethics, a certain standard of what to do and what not to do. That's part of a larger set of instructions or moral principles, I think we might say, that help us flourish as human beings and as a culture. So there are rules out there. They're not written. Well, they are written. For example, the Judeo-Christian concept of morality, they correspond very closely to that. But there's other civilizations that didn't have, let's say, a Judeo-Christian set of rules or set of moral laws, but they had their own morality, which corresponds very closely to that, which is often referred to as traditional morality today. So we have traditional morality, which implies often it's not a good thing for premarital sexual relations. And once you do get married, it's best if you can have a lifelong monogamous relationship. So that's a general rule, but the question is why? Because when we look at the scientific laws, the laws of physics, we can observe certain patterns. And it's the same way in the social sciences. We can observe the human data and history to see that there's recurring patterns. And we can glean laws from this. So, for example, force equals mass times acceleration is a simple law in physics. In sociology, we can observe that there seem to be some operating principles there as well. The difference is that the laws of physics, we can't break. If you step off a cliff, you will experience Newton's laws, whether you believe in them or not. You will reap the consequences, but in the social sciences, you can break these operating instructions, let's say when it comes to sexuality, and you may not immediately observe the consequences, but long-term you will. You will observe the consequences both in terms of a person's personal life as well as in the culture. But there's a problem, and the problem is that people want what they want. They want to live however they choose to live. And secondly, they refuse to learn, or they simply don't learn from the lessons of history. And so let's say J.D. Unwin publishes his magnificent works. And by the way, he says in his book that this book is only a summary. It would actually take 20 volumes to fully articulate or write down all his observations on sex and culture. So people even today, when I talk to them about J.D. Unwin, there are many people who just want to believe that's not true. And they ignore it because they have their own wants, their own desires, their own wishes. We could call them their own animal instincts, for example. And they don't see why they should live their life according to these social laws or these social principles or these operating instructions for the flourishing of humanity. So they don't. And as a result, I find in my discussions, probably many people think they're interesting, but most people just, or a lot of people just dismiss them. And they don't dismiss them on rational grounds. They dismiss them because they don't want them to be true. They don't want to live that way. So that's the part of the problem. The laws of physics, you step off a cliff, you instantly experience the laws of physics. But in sociology, there's a delayed reaction. And often our society thinks very short term. It's almost blind to long-term consequences. And even if it has heard of the long-term consequences, it does not want to believe them. And so consequently, even though I do think there are, let's say, operating instructions that are just as real as the laws of physics, we tend to often not want to live by them. One more thing, I was visiting a think tank in Washington, D.C., Heritage Foundation, and they have a department that just specializes on data from the social sciences, and the head of that department told me one day, he said, even if we knew nothing of morality and ethics, just the data from the social sciences that have accumulated over history tells us that there are laws of human flourishing. And if we lived by those laws, we would flourish. But as I said, unfortunately, people have their own wants and they ignore the laws.
I am 64 years old, and the first time I heard about Joseph Unwin. I am very strong advocate of works of such a people as John Glubb, and I would like to ask you whether you know him or not. Okay, John Glubb, do you know him?
A little bit.
A little bit.
The quote that I really like and I heartily agree with is John wrote, "Priceless lessons could be learned if the history of the past 4,000 years could be thoroughly and impartially studied." And I totally agree. And I think back to my own education in history in my school years, grades 1 through 12. And unfortunately, we spent most of the time memorizing dates and events, but very little time, almost none, drawing lessons from that. That's one problem. But there's a new problem I've observed in our culture today, and that is there's a tendency to want to rewrite history or interpret history to make it fit what we want to believe. And that's a very dangerous thing, because if we do that, we actually blind ourselves to the lessons that we could learn in history. Of course, I would admit that many historical writings might be biased or might be nuanced in a little way to that writer's own perspective, but that requires additional historical research. We should just do historical research objectively and then try and learn, as Unwin did. This is exactly what he did. He dispassionately and objectively simply made observations, and these observations were so vivid that we could learn a very important lesson from it.
Okay,
but
so
I think
John Glubb studied, let's say, 12 civilization and the process of rise and falling down, and he drew the same conclusions. Maybe not so precise, but in some level of generality, you can consider them as a law of physics. We have also experiment of John Calhoun performed on rats. When in subsequent generations the population of rats just disintegrated, they all died because of changes in their behavior, in social behavior, and finally they didn't manage to have a offspring, so they died off.
Yeah.
And we have also experiments of Ron Jones, who transformed the teenagers, the group of 200 teenagers, within 5 days into fighting fascists, and so we in Polish-American Foundation for Economic Research and Education, we are talking about this very often because we consider it's very important for the society, for building the best socio-political systems. But these people, I mean Unwin, Glubb, Calhoun and Ron Jones, they are completely unknown. And why does it happen?
I don't know. I think there's a resistance, because I've seen that resistance firsthand. There's a resistance against the findings because it doesn't fit what our culture today wants. So that's number one. Because of that resistance, it's censored, it's misrepresented, as if, for example, a very common objection I run into with Unwin's research and some of these others, that experiment by rats was fascinating, by the way. And what people can be led to do within a very short period of time, it just underscores we need some operating instructions that are objective so that when we are exposed to destructive tendencies, we can actually make the right decisions. But another reason that it's suppressed is that it's seen as out of date. For example, I've seen that often. That's the number one objection against Unwin. People will say, well, we're in the 21st century now. We know a lot more, and therefore, we don't need to worry about these things. Well, the actual matter is that those 86 civilizations have not changed just because we're in the 21st century. Secondly, and this is one thing that Robert P. George pointed out in his the Princeton professor, when he was talking about Unwin, he said no one, even up to today, has done the rigorous research that J.D. Unwin has. So we have this conception in our head, it's actually called the chronological fallacy, is that newer is better. So our newer way of looking at things, which is not good at all because it's abandoning rational thinking. And also, one more thing, we're finding that in the humanities, and this problem exists in the sciences as well, there is a growing problem of reproducibility, and that's because human bias is sneaking in, or competition for funding. But that's another topic there. But because of that, we tend to just say, oh, we don't need to study these people because they're obsolete. We know more now. And so my question is, well, if we know more now, where is that research published? Can I look at it? What sort of data do we have? And when you ask that question, you find out, well, there's nothing. They have not, there's no new data that, at least data that's impeccable, because there is a tendency nowadays to even choose one study, pre-filter study groups to give the kind of results people want. So one has to be very careful looking at that data. But in Unwin's time, there was no pressure to do that. He had no pressure he was surprised at his own results.
So Kirk, thank you very much for this extremely interesting interview. I will put it in the first three my best interviews I have ever had. But I would like to ask you to sum up our discussion. Could you please mention once again, repeat the main messages of Sex and Culture's Unwin book?
Okay, sure. So J.D. Unwin was a social anthropologist, published in the mid-1930s, studied 86 civilizations and cultures, and he found basically that the higher standards they had, the more restraints they imposed on themselves with how they practiced their sexuality, the better that culture flourished in terms of architecture, music, literature, agriculture, technology, and so forth. Found there was a direct correlation there. When a culture began to loosen up its sexual constraints, had their own sexual revolution, as we might say, every culture collapsed within 3 generations, which for Unwin was about 100 years. It was irreversible, there were no exceptions, and it happened with, and I quote, monotonous regularity. And what happened immediately after that culture reduced its sexual constraints or loosened up, had their own sexual liberation, so to speak, is they abandoned their belief in God or their higher gods. They abandoned rational thinking, and lifelong monogamous marriages were replaced with serial relationships. The first generation only slightly deteriorated after that tipping point was reached. The second generation went into a much faster decline, and in the third generation, that culture collapsed after loosening their sexual constraints. There were no exceptions. And he observed this correlation meticulously, rigorously, and no one, even up to today in the academic world, has achieved the same level of data and examined that data on the same quantity as J.D. Unwin has.
Thank you so much. We will try to beat your records of viewers on YouTube, because maybe Polish society is a little bit more traditional than Canadian and North American societies. Thank you once again, and we will try to spread this message, because as we consider it's very important for building better societies. Thank you, Kirk.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.